All right, Tuesday, November 22nd. Welcome back to That Change Show. I'm your host, Jason Little, and I'm going to share a little story about the first time that I went through a mass layoff. And it was the dot-com era, late 90s, early 2000s. So if you were around back then, you remember when the bubble burst and a bunch of tech companies went under. There were mass layoffs, et cetera, et cetera. I was working as a web developer in a marketing department for basically a CRM and no-code company. The term no-code didn't exist back then, but no-code platforms did exist back then. I think we were around maybe 650, 700 people or so. We were all in one building. This was before remote working was popular, so everybody was typically in the office. And it wasn't uncommon for this company to do town halls where we had grown to a point where we now had to cram into meeting rooms all over the building. So when we were smaller, we used to be able to use the lobby in the basement, on the first floor. But then as we grew, they kind of had to scatter us around. So nobody thought anything of it when we got the invite. Said, Jason, you're going to room 3F for the all company, blah, 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 blah. So they could make sure people were all in the right rooms. And I don't remember if it was the CTO, CIO, whoever it was, came on the speakerphone to start the meeting and said, well, we have some bad news. Unfortunately, we're letting go of X percent of our staff. And I don't remember what X percent was. Maybe it was like 20% or something like that. Wasn't insignificant anyway. And whoever it was on the speakerphone said, we're not... if you're in the room where you're hearing this message, you're safe. So chances are some of your coworkers that you might not see in the room where you're currently in are going to be let go. They're going to get 15 minutes to clean up their desks, and then whoosh, they'll be escorted out. So that was not a fun way to start a Monday. And we all went back to our desks, and sure enough, I think one, maybe two people in my department were let go. And it was pretty crappy. Obviously, some people were upset, and some people were like, well, whatever, I'll find another job anywhere. But the groundwork had been laid. So the next time they did this, about a few weeks later, we got the same invites. So here's your invite to room 3F. It's the all company town hall. And of course, during the span between the first session and this one, there were all, of course, rumors going around about what's going on with the company, etc., etc. And the second round was very much like American Idol, if you've ever watched the show where they're hunting for new singers. And it was, you're in the room and you're waiting, and then Randy and Paula kind of open up the doors and they pause a little bit and they go, you're all safe. And we're all like, oh. But the anxiety of going through that, getting the invite, going into the meeting room, looking around the meeting room and going, well, that person looks, they're a pretty hard worker. You know, they know their stuff. Maybe I'm okay, but that other person over there is kind of sketchy, so maybe I'm not too safe. So they ended up doing that a third time. But between the second time and the third time, I was in marketing. Our senior director or director, I don't remember the exact title, but the highest person in marketing that was left, said, you know, they haven't clarified anything. No one's told us what's going on. Everybody just go home and I'll call you back in when they have stuff to do. So I went home and played video games for a few weeks. This was 22, 23 years ago. And then when it came time to do round number 3, it was handled a little bit differently because there was such a small number of staff left that I remember being brought into I believe the CFO's office at the time, maybe it was the CTO, I can't remember, who told me, yep, you're going to be let go, but we're keeping you for a month. Like, the rest of marketing is gone, so there's nobody else left in marketing or the web team, and we're going to keep you around for a month, and you can transition any of the technical stuff to Biff over in IT. So I was like, oh, okay, I guess that's good. So I was the last person left on the floor, and Biff didn't care either way. So Biff was actually creating another startup that I actually worked with him with. And if you remember, before these iPhones existed, you had to pay $4 for a crappy sounding ringtone that just sounded like bleep, bloop, bleep, bloop. That was probably us. So we were one of the first companies. Well, we were the first company to do this in Canada. So Biff didn't care either way. So I had basically the run of the floor for a month. And then the very last day, I think the IT manager went around. There was maybe 25 of us left in the whole company. And he said, well, today's the last day. The doors are locked at noon. Security cameras are off. Have a good life. And that was it. So I'm telling that story because people have been asking me, what do you think about Elon's change management strategy? Because my world has changed. And the approach that he's taking. Plus, I always get a kick out of the disposable outrage mentality and the mob mentality that happens every time Elon does something. And I don't think people are aware of how often that happens everywhere else, but nobody gives a shit unless Elon does it, which is pretty interesting. So, when I think of my situation back then, what would have been the alternative for the leaders in the company to do something like that? Like back then there was no social media. So maybe you could get away with a tactic like that, but what would be the alternative? I think people forget that running a company is difficult, and those decisions, it's not like Elon sitting there with an org chart going, well, here's 3 junior testers, get rid of them, get rid of those. Of course not. There's probably a target. This has happened to me in the past. I worked for a company where we weren't doing well financially. At one point, the CEO had to put in $100,000 of his own money to make payroll. And on one occasion, we had to cut a person from each department. And as the manager, I had to pick. So I remember at the time not thinking there was an alternative. I'm being asked to do this, so I have to figure it out. So I had to sit there and look at the 5 people and go, whose life do I ruin? And I think people are misdirecting their outrage to a certain degree. But nowadays, when I think about that story, I think what I would do now is I would go back to the CEO and I would say, well, let's talk about how much money we need to save immediately. And what's our cash flow, what's our run rate, et cetera, and then suggest, well, why don't all of us take a 10% pay cut so we can keep this other person? I think that would have been a really strong rallying cry around the culture. And if we could have been more transparent about the cash flow situation and just literally a big visible wall of revenue versus expenses, and then keep the whole company kind of in the light, if you will, about what was going on. Now, we were small enough. We were about 25 people at the time, so something like that might have been possible. But like I said, it's interesting for me to see all of the public outrage just because it's Elon. Now, the interesting thing is you look what he did with Twitter there. And, you look at, there was an article somebody had posted on LinkedIn about that style is very Jack Welch-ish, who was the CEO of GE way back when. Very much the bell curve, cut the bottom 20, focused on business, no emotion, business is business. And the hypothesis is that worked great back then. It's going to backfire today because of the world that we live in. And who knows, who knows in a year from now what the situation at Twitter is going to be like. I can think of another situation where I was working for a blogging platform company that's basically WordPress, but back in the day when you could charge people a lot of money for what is essentially now WordPress. And I remember my first day on the job, I got a stack of accounts files. Here's all of our clients. We've been offline for 2 days. The last 2 days, they all hate us. Here you go. So not starting off in a great situation to begin with. And I had taken less money to join that company in exchange for a guaranteed raise in 3 months. And I remember in 3 months when I went in to have that conversation, my boss just said, well, we're not happy with your performance and you're not getting a raise. Like, go back to your desk. Which obviously, I was much, much younger back then. And I was like, that kind of sucks. I guess I'll work harder. And that was probably one of the worst places I ever worked because we had landed a gigantic account with a global news distributor who you would all know if I said the name, but I'm not going to say the name, but you can infer from that what you will. And the brain trust running the place gave the account to a 22-year-old web designer and then blamed her when things went sideways. So that tells you a little bit about what the leadership was like there. And I had my Office Space moment 6 or 7 months into that job, and we had just bought a house. We were about a week away from having our second child. I walked into my boss's office and I said, yeah, I'm going to stop working here. I don't have anything else to go to now. All I know is I don't want to be here anymore. I'll give you a month notice, and I might ask for an afternoon off a couple of times for some interviews, and that was it. My whole team quit within 3 weeks of each other. It was that bad of a situation. And I remember being called out on calls and hung out to dry from the CEO. We were working on a project, an integration project with another company, and we were late. So they were doing we were doing like a rapid day in and day out break fix where we were getting ready to go live. They would send us back a spreadsheet of things they found. We'd fix them and send it back. And we were kind of in that just final stages of getting things done and ready. And those calls were not great because the CEO was taking the side of the client and blaming me for everything. So that just tells you a little bit about that environment. And when that company closed down, I had left by that point, but I had a friend still working there. People showed up. It was the week before Christmas, and they showed up to work, and the building was empty and the doors were locked. So, when you think of what's going on with Twitter and these mass layoffs and the amount of outrage and experts who think they can do a better job out there saying, oh, Elon should do this, that, and the other. I guess the only thing I would say is, why don't you start your own PayPal or space exploration company or your own car company and see how hard it is. It's pretty easy to sit on the sidelines and criticize things. I'm not pro or anti Elon Musk. I really don't care either way because it doesn't really concern me. People are talking about it's a clinic and how not to run a company. But it's people who want eyeballs on their articles. And you think of situations like people have a very short memory. Remember Marissa Mayer, Yahoo? Remember when she did the exact same thing in 2016, 2017? Maybe it was earlier than that when she took over from Yahoo. I'm going to put articles, links to articles in the show notes as well. So if you're watching this obviously on YouTube, you're going to see the articles on the screen. If you're listening in your podcast listener thingamajiggy, you will be able to get all these references here. But what I wanted to do was I just wanted to kind of poke around and see, we're outraged about what's going on by Twitter just because it's Elon. That's really it. This kind of thing happens all the time. And if you're paying attention to the news cycle, to be a little conspiracy theorist here, soon as he started doing this, you may not have noticed all the other mass layoffs that piggybacked on top of it in a very quiet way. Amazon, 10,000 people. Facebook, 11,000 people. Google is now talking about, there's articles about Google's layoffs that are going to be coming up. And I do have an article from Mondo, again, I'll put the links in the show notes, that breaks down all the mass layoffs in 2022. And how come nobody gives a shit about the rest of those? Just because it's Elon and he's a polarizing character. So when people ask me about his approach for change, I see it very similar to what Marissa did at Yahoo. Basically threw a gigantic rock in a pond. And I don't think there is a conscious strategy for change management because, that's my world. And I'll see change people on LinkedIn saying, oh, Elon Musk doesn't know what good change management is. Elon Musk doesn't give a shit about what change management is. The thought isn't there from some of these leaders. It's what would you expect him to do? Spin up a change management project to do something like this? So I think he's smart enough to know that they needed a giant rock in the pond, much like Marissa did with Yahoo back in the day, much like GM did when they go through their tens of thousands of layoffs pretty much every year. Every auto sector does that. Ford just announced 3,000 people that are going to be laid off. I think 2,000 are permanent employees and 1,000 are contractor employees. Peloton is laying off 20% of their workforce. And I don't know if we're still mad at Peloton or not for that commercial. Maybe some people are, maybe some people don't care. I would assume most probably don't even remember because every day there's a new story about outrage. So, this article that I'm looking at from Mondo goes on and on about Netflix and Coinbase and DocuSign. and Beachbody, Ford, 7-Eleven, Shopify, Vimeo. Layoffs are a way of corporate life. You can like it, you can not like it. That's the way it works, especially for publicly traded companies. Think of how many times the big banks have let go of a bunch of people to inflate their numbers for shareholders. And a lot of large companies I worked for, they follow the same pattern. They do a mass layoff in one quarter, they hire them right back at the beginning of the next quarter. They meet the numbers, they meet the targets, people are outraged for about 30 seconds, and then nobody cares anymore. So, when you think of the 3,700 people that were laid off at Twitter, and there was a rumor that 1,200 more had resigned on top of that, that's nothing compared to what some of these other large companies do. So when you, again, getting back, trying to keep this on track, because this topic makes people very angry. I was looking at a bunch of LinkedIn posts, and I'm going to hide these from the screen because I don't want the people's names out there, because that's not the point. Some people saying, that's the final straw, I'm getting off Twitter. And I'm thinking, that's your final straw? Have you never been on Twitter for the last decade? Twitter is a toxic waste dump. It always has been, it always will be, because the vocal minority go there to just complain about stuff. I only use Twitter basically for work stuff. So just to post what's going on with workshops and things like that. And I've got a couple of friend lists and some stuff for my music and then some direct messages, and that's it. Don't look at the hashtags. Don't look at what's trending. None of that stuff, because it doesn't matter. So I think, again, like trying to keep it back on the rails, is throwing a rock in a pond is a really good way to shake up a company that needs shaking up. So if there is a very, very strong status quo that's difficult to break, the foreign element needs to be strong enough and intense enough to force the system into change. If the foreign element is not strong enough, nothing will change. And it depends on really what information do you want to believe that's been posted about Twitter, because the employees that have been let go, obviously they're angry, so they're going to air the dirty laundry on Twitter. People are going to post things like Business Insider and Forbes have jumped on this too with their op-eds and things like that. And who knows what's true? Elon says they're losing, $4 million a day. They're going to be bankrupt soon. He did the same thing with SpaceX. He did the same thing with Tesla. And actually one of the posts for Tesla was around December 24th, 2008. Tesla's financing round was closed, and it was the last hour of the day before they went bankrupt. So he said stuff like this publicly before. He also said he gave the last of his remaining cash from PayPal to Tesla just to keep it afloat. When the Model 3 came out, he said the same thing. We were 2 weeks away from bankruptcy, and who knows if that's true. I'm sure if you're a financial analyst, you could pretty easily go into the financial projections and the history and all that type of stuff, and you could see. There's also rumors that they're spending $400 a day per employee for food, and there were 10 managers for every one developer. Like I said, who knows if any of this stuff is true, but you think of... Let's make an assumption that the company was in bad financial shape. What's the alternative to mass layoffs or getting cash infusions? What else are they going to do? So should they, from a change management perspective, should he have gone to the change management department and said, we need to run a change management project so we can do a restructuring and blah, 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 blah. And then the change management team goes away for a month and creates a plan and tries to unleash it on the organization. And, that's ridiculous talk, I think. I think, in the case of Marissa and Jack Welch and some of these other more polarizing, abrasive leaders, have a style that some people like and some people don't. And I think what we're just seeing in social media is a manifestation of just the fact that it's Elon, that people are outraged about this, and they're outraged with what he's doing. But nobody's outraged about Facebook or Google or the automakers or all the Canadian banks, or here in Canada, Loblaws, for example, who did a small layoff. I think I'm going to say about 500 people or so, and then posted an article about their record profits. amongst driving grocery prices up that people were upset about, and they were upset about that for about 5 seconds, and then nobody cared anymore. Okay, so I'm going to get into the wrap up because I could go on forever, and the only evidence I have for that is I've tried to do this wrap up about 9 times now, and I normally do these shows live, but this is such a polarizing topic. I'm trying to be careful with my choice of language. When people ask, what do I think about Elon's approach to change? Or the commentary around Elon doesn't understand change management, or this is a classic case study that will be talked about for years and years in Harvard Business Review about how not to run a company. First, separate signal from noise. Most of that is noise, and most of it is because the situation at Twitter is being played out in the public eye, and it's the pile-on mentality. Everybody wants to pile on the thing that's popular. One, because they feel they want their voice heard, or two, they want eyeballs on their articles. And 0% of that matters to the people that are working at Twitter, or Elon's perspective about how he wants to do things. None of them care about that at all. It's just like a bunch of hall monitors and nosy neighbors who are just arguing at the water cooler about, this is the way it was before social media, right? You'd go to work and you'd complain about stuff at the water cooler. Nobody cares. So I go to 2 places. 1, what's the viable alternative in the context? And 2, what can we learn from it, positive and negative? So what's an alternative in the context? For me, it depends on whose data you want to believe. Were they really losing $4 million a day? Are they still losing $4 million a day? Who knows? Were they really spending $13 million a year in food service? Who knows? Because data has gone back and forth about, the person who runs the program said it's false. And then there was more data that Elon presented that it's not false. It's like, here's the data from about how much we spend on this, and some calculations about how that fiddles its way down to a per person cost. The 10 managers per developer, who knows? So I would say, what would a viable alternative be to handle this the way these normally get handled, which is they usually get dropped into the organization from the top, and the managers now have to decide who to cut, or HR has to decide based on performance reviews who has to get cut. And with that many people, 3,700 people, that process could take a long time. Maybe the company would have been bankrupt and everybody would have been out of jobs by then. It's hard to say. But is it an alternative? Sure. A viable one in that context? It's hard to say because I don't know the context like all the people working there. And I'm certainly not going to take any stock in a disgruntled employee doing an off-the-cuff tweet about how terrible it is in there. Because I'm sure there's still people at Twitter working there that still love it, because that's just the way the world is. There's always going to be people that hate things that go on in their companies and people that like it. Another alternative, Honda did this recently, which was early severance, combination of age and years of service. That's a very common way of doing restructuring and mass layoffs in the auto sector. That probably doesn't apply to the Twitter context. I don't know what the age range and who would be eligible for early retirement, or even if that concept exists in knowledge work anymore. Who knows? So given the context, it's really difficult to say. All I can say from a change perspective is if there isn't a big enough disruption, change won't happen. And I would guess in the moment Elon felt that a big change was needed for a bunch of reasons and just threw the rock in the pond. And I don't think it was conscious. I think that's just his style because he's done that at SpaceX and at Tesla as well. That's just his style. Like it or love it. Like it or love it? Like it or not like it? You can tell I've done this exit or this outro part like 9 times because I'm getting pretty tired. So, yeah, context. Second, what can we learn from it? Positives and negatives. I think on the positive side, every good leadership article out there will tell you that good leaders lead by example. And they get involved and they don't ask their people to do what they're not willing to do. And that's what he's doing. He's sleeping in the offices there. He did this with Tesla. He slept on the factory floor when they were going through production hell. So on the positive side, you can say He's not asking anybody to do what he's not willing to do. On the negative side, you can say, the ultimatums of anybody who's not willing to work this number of hours, get out. So, obviously that's terrible for a lot of the people there. So, like I said, it is a pretty touchy situation. I think he made the decision because he had enough data to say this is what needs to happen to prevent the company from going under. And we can learn from those positives and those negatives. So like I said, on the positive side, he's not asking anybody to do what he's not willing to do. And on the negative side, it's a pretty horrible way to treat people. But like I said, the worst part of this whole thing is the fact that it's playing out in a public forum. And I don't think if it was playing out in a public forum, it would be that big of a deal. There'd be a press release saying Twitter lays off 50% of their workforce. You'd get a few people tweeting about their dissatisfaction with it, like you see in all reorgs, because you'll see I've been let go from my company that I've been with for 20 years. And then, that person has 100 followers and 5 people go, oh, so sorry to hear that company's terrible. And then nobody cares 5 seconds later. It's kind of the same thing with the other hundreds of companies who have done mass layoffs this year. We've got a short memory. We're going to forget all about this for the most part, other than the fact that it's Twitter and it's Elon and it's playing out in the public eye. So I think some of the lessons that we can take forward is, as change managers, HR people, leaders in companies who need to do these types of things, expect there's going to be a larger, more noise than there is going to be signal when these things happen, because they do play out in public forum. And I think that should be the topic of these articles, not so much he's putting on a clinic about how not to run a company. I think it would be really helpful and pretty awesome, actually, to see more case studies and articles around how different it is to run companies nowadays, because every company has a magnifying glass on them. Anyone has an opinion they can voice. And if a small minority of people make a big enough stink, that now becomes the truth. And that's what has basically happened with the advance of social media, especially in the case of Twitter. So I think we can take all of these lessons and we can start to think about how do we not get ourselves in these situations in the first place? So I guess I'll close off with a little story about Toyota. So there is, I believe this is still true today, but Toyota has not let go of a salaried employee since the 50s, I believe. So they will relocate, reskill, move people around, but they haven't had to let go of salaried employees because it happened once in the 50s and it was such a bad experience that they didn't want to do that again. So I think we can take a combination of all these other mass layoffs that happen and the different styles that leaders do and the different approaches that we have for it. And we've got enough data to tell stories and talk about what was the cause and effect, because we're not going to know the effect of this approach of just kind of blowing up the ship for weeks, months, maybe even this same time next year. So Elon's going to look like a genius if he gets turned around, and he's going to look like an idiot if it doesn't get turned around. And either way, people are still going to be talking about they either love him or they hate him, because probably by the time I'm done finishing this sentence, he's said another 5 stupid things on Twitter. So that's it for this week's episode. Remember to like and subscribe. And drop your comments on the YouTube channel as well. What do you think about this? Because I think I've been maybe a little wishy-washy in this episode. I wanted to try and keep it low-key because it is, like I said, it is a topic that makes a lot of people upset. But it's hard to sit back and judge without a deep understanding of the context. And I think all the other armchair quarterbacks out there on Twitter complaining about this, and people on LinkedIn writing articles about how they weren't agile enough or these other stupid things would be well served to just leave it in the comment section and just let it go. So that's it for this episode. I'm Jason Little, your host of That Change Show, and I'll see you next time.